Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at the villainous governor from seasons 3 and 4 of AMC's The Walking Dead. In a zombie-infested world where the lines of morality are blurred, the governor is an antagonist whose motives and actions leave much to be scrutinized, leaving us to wonder at what point can self-preservation be considered as evil, when probably everyone else would do the same. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the governor's survivor mentality, the thought processes that lead to his actions, as well as the morality of said actions. But a small disclaimer, given that the iteration that we see on TV and in the comics are largely different, to keep things precise, this video will focus solely on the character we see on screen. I'm aware that there is much backstory offered in the novels, but since they pertain only to the iteration in the comics, I've chosen to set it aside for the sake of this video. Now with that said, let's continue. To start things off, the governor for the most part remains a mystery in terms of his past, and it doesn't help that he's rather secretive about it. From what is revealed to us, he was known as Philip Blake in his past life, married to a wife with one daughter, and living a mundane existence as a middle-class citizen, mentioning that he wasn't proud of his job, his house, or his car. Perhaps the point of all this is that the governor was just like the common layperson, living an average life that you wouldn't find anything remarkable about, at least in this iteration. He didn't start out this way, meaning that given the right circumstances, it's possible that the average person could eventually degenerate to his state if they're not careful. Even our protagonist, Rick, himself teeters along this line and constantly faces the same temptations as him. While in his former life, the governor was a subordinate who despised his boss half his age and deemed to have an IQ even lower, now he is at the top of the pecking order, being chosen by his group of survivors as their leader. From his appearance and his mannerisms, we can easily see why this is so. The governor is tall, pleasant-looking, and with an authoritative voice that would easily inspire and command respect. As the appointed leader of the town of Woodbury, the governor appears to be doing quite all right. When you have a town of 73 residents, it's no small feat to be able to provide some semblance of normalcy, especially in a world overrun by zombies. Anyone would be immensely grateful to have 4 walls, fresh clothing, and ample food daily. It's even more impressive that Woodbury goes beyond this, to the point of hosting celebration parties that would momentarily transport you back to a happier time when the world hasn't gone to crud. Of course, it's absolutely natural to yearn for how the way things were. But in all this, we see a key mindset of the governor's, that he is a man who is in a partial state of denial and still struggling to let go of the past. But given how relatively early they are in the outbreak, this is still somewhat expected. A noteworthy example would be the fact that the citizens of Woodbury remain largely untrained in combat. Given the times that they are in, that is rather unacceptable, and if we're comparing to Rick's group, even young Coral is relatively advanced in his combat skills. The simple answer behind this might be expressed in one word which I just mentioned, normalcy, but in the form of living a leisurely life. Eat, drink, and be merry, a line which the governor himself states at one point amidst his constant consumption of alcohol. Beyond this, the pinnacle of the governor's reluctance to let go is seen with his daughter Penny, who has long turned into a walker, yet he is still convinced that she's somewhere in there. But while he holds on to the past, that's not to say that the governor hasn't adapted himself to the current times. On one end, he's no doubt saved many lives and is now responsible for the welfare of the 73 people in Woodbury. On the other, we can infer that his hands are stained with the blood of far more individuals, perhaps outweighing any good he has done. We get a glimpse into his mental descent through his diary. We see that at the start, the governor was still keeping track of the people who died by name right until the point of his daughter Penny. From there, the deaths are no longer recorded by name, but now instead by a single stroke of the pen, highlighting a stark desensitization to death. As tragic as that sounds, this is somewhat expected, as there are only so many deaths that one can witness before eventually becoming numb to its exposure. But to make things worse, based on his current course of actions, we can have no doubt that many of the deaths listed in his diary are those that have come by his own hand. The governor is not just desensitized to violence, he has developed a devious taste for it, choosing to finish off the walkers by a melee weapon under the guise of not wasting a bullet. Given the amount of stress the governor is under, from losing his family to the everyday strain of caring for a town, combined with the anxiety that this could be your last day on Earth, we can easily see that he would need an outlet. No one would object to killing walkers, and many other characters throughout the series use them as a form of release for their pent-up emotions. However, when we consider the governor's beliefs that it's possible for a person to maintain their consciousness after transformation, the implications of his actions become far worse. Of course, from our perspective, we know that once a person has died or is bitten, then that person is as good as dead and forever gone. But since the governor still believes that a person's consciousness may still be present, then that presents his actions in a different light. By his standard and from his perspective, he is committing possible murder when he kills walkers for reasons other than self-defense. Not that it matters to him, as we see that he is very much open to killing humans as well, which we'll get to in a bit. There is much contrast between the governor's public personality and the darker side that only a select few get to see. At the core, he is a man torn between two opposing directions. On one end, he is holding on to whatever remnant he has of the former way of life, hosting parties and other typical activities of the past. On the other end, he keeps an aquarium of walker heads to serve as both a trophy case and to keep himself numb to the violence he feels compelled to partake in. The people of Woodbury also display this dichotomy, and no better example is seen by the fact that by day they appear to live normal lives, while at night they attend the gladiator-style games surrounded by walkers as a form of entertainment. It's risky and foolish, but then again, there are more dangerous ways to blow off steam in a time like this. At face value, the governor appears to be benevolent, welcoming strangers into his town and providing them with daily necessities. But this kindness is cloaked in deception for two reasons: for the fact that the governor only takes in the weak and the helpless, and once you enter, you cannot leave. Ironically, the town of Woodbury is more akin to a prison in practice when compared to Rick's new home of an actual prison. So if you're armed or a potential threat, Woodbury is the last place you'd want to visit. This brings us to the crux of the governor's actions and the aspect of him that is morally questionable: the fact that he proactively goes out in search of what he deems to be potential threats and strikes first in the name of self-preservation. Or in short, he does first to others before they can do to him. This is seen most clearly in his killing of the National Guard convoy, who did nothing to provoke him or deserve lethal force. Now in the course of the series, we are presented with many morally gray choices, and almost everyone's hands are dirty. Every kill is a kill, and each kill has the same end result: the loss of life. But morality doesn't exist in a vacuum, as there are nuances behind each motive that we need to consider. Sometimes to save a life, you have no choice but to take a life, or sometimes there is no other option due to other constraints. As for the governor's actions, however, if we're comparing them on a spectrum with the other survival decisions of the other characters, they are often seen as the most morally questionable among them all, or in other words, leaning the most heavily onto the side of evil. As for why this is seen as such, I'll contrast it with some of the other characters' actions to illustrate, followed by exploring the one key question: are the governor's actions unnecessary evil? First of all, we have the pressure of time. There was no rush for the governor to do what he did with the National Guard, and clearly it was premeditated and well thought out. In comparison, an act of killing done in self-defense and in the heat of the moment is a lot more forgivable, such as Coral's killing of the Woodbury teenager while he was in the midst of surrendering. In hindsight, was it wrong for Coral to kill the teenager? Yes, it probably was. But given the situation, we can't fully blame Coral for it, given that he's still a kid who's new to all this, and the teenager made the mistake of creeping forward instead of dropping his weapon as instructed. Next, we have the issue of an impending threat. The National Guard were still far off and had no knowledge of Woodbury. The perceived threat was real, but still relatively low, with the word perceive being the emphasis, which I'll get more to later. Whereas, if there was a clear and existing danger, it would be less incriminating to spur into action, such as Carol's killing of Karen and David at the prison. Her intentions were noble in protecting the rest of the prison from the infection, and eventually Tyrese was able to forgive her. But overall, her actions here are still very much open to criticism, for the fact that there was still the first factor of time to discuss this with the rest of the council and see if there was any other less grisly solution. But nevertheless, there was the presence of a real impending threat as people were already dying, and given the uncertainty surrounding the infection, she chose to err on the safe side as a gamble. If the infection did turn out to be as severe as she thought, then it would soften the blow of her actions and she would have been credited for saving the lives of everyone else. And finally, we come to a third issue, when there is simply no choice due to a lack of resources. Now, this isn't a straight-up kill, but more of an indirect one through abandonment, as we see in the case with Rick when he chooses to turn a deaf ear to the cries of a hitchhiker, and eventually the man ends up dying on the road. This is also seen when Rick rejects Tyrese and his group from joining theirs and chooses to kick them out to fend for themselves. In these scenarios, you aren't directly responsible for their deaths if it happens, but you are at least somewhat culpable, as leaving them to themselves could very well be their death sentence. But at the same time, you are powerless to help them, as you already do not have enough resources for your own community, and bringing in more people would only have the effect of reducing your own chances of survival. Not to mention the inherent risk that these new individuals could pose a threat should they try to take over your resources by force. In this new state of the world, trust is the rarest form of currency, and sometimes you just don't know who to trust. In such cases, the regrettable but necessary thing to do would be to simply turn them away for your own survival. To tie this back to the governor's case, we find that they are viewed the worst among all the other morally gray decisions we've seen so far, for the fact that all three elements are missing: the pressure of time, the perception of a current existing threat, or the constraint of limited resources. But with all that said, while the governor's actions lean the most heavily onto the side of evil, that doesn't mean they aren't still morally ambiguous. And for that, let's take into account the governor's position and the state of the world for a bit. In Woodbury's current state, they appear to have at most 10 to 20 residents who are trained for combat. These precious few residents who are trained aren't really military, but more of self-taught. And now you have a sizable group of professionally trained soldiers with a loaded arsenal within the vicinity of your town. Given the current living conditions of these soldiers, you can be pretty sure that they would love to move in on your area of residence. Again, while there appears to be no immediate threat, with immediate being the emphasis, there still lies a possible danger at the end. Things could escalate faster than you think, and it might be too late if you prolong your decision-making. As Season 4 shows us, in such times as these, people are willing to eradicate another group for the sake of their resources, such as the camp in the forest where its occupants were all murdered by another group. Another trend that seems to recur is that whenever two separate societies cannot integrate successfully, the inevitable result is war. As for the presence of the National Guard, there are a few possible ways to look at this. Yes, you could suggest that if the military found out about his presence, They might have moved in and taken over his position of authority, and that's something he doesn't want to lose. The fact that the governor makes everyone address him formally by that title perhaps stems from his ego. Then there's also the obvious allure of their much-needed resources with their food and their arsenal, which would strengthen Woodbury as a community. But more likely, even if it was some other group that's not military, I'm pretty sure the governor would have done exactly the same. Again, this is seen by the fact that he only takes in people that he deems weak, and more so by his hostile reaction when he discovers Rick and his group are nearby, and views them as a threat after hearing of their conquering of the prison. So it's not so much the issue that they're military that the governor killed them, but more so of them being a viable threat. And I don't believe that this is the first time that the governor has done something like this. A person does not become so cold-blooded overnight, but rather in progressive stages. It's very likely that the governor has done this to similar camps in his vicinity in the past, whether military or not. So from the governor's perspective, he likely views the military in the same lens as he does with Rick's group. Those soldiers we see are free agents anyway, having abandoned their position. They no longer answer to any government or authority, meaning that eventually they will form their own sub-society. So for the sake of expediency, let's just label anyone outside of Woodbury as an outsider, whether it's the National Guard or Rick's group. Now let's assume we are in the governor's position. With the presence of these outsiders nearby, you cannot help but be concerned about the safety of your own town. Yes, there is a chance that these outsiders may not have detected your town and would have just moved on past the area. But what if that doesn't happen and they do decide to invade, like what we see with the camp in Season 4? You've seen enough examples to know that this is a real possibility. With your limited defenses, you would be powerless to stop them, and you would have allowed your town of 73 people to suffer, starve to death, or be killed. But if you do decide to strike first, then the blood of these soldiers is now on your hands. So the governor is effectively stuck between a rock and a hard place, damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. So the question becomes, how much risk are you willing to bear? You could spare the lives of these outsiders by not engaging, but then it comes at the risk of your community's safety. Now, we surely wouldn't like it if someone invaded our town and killed us for our resources, but what if that is now the state of the world, and the best way to defend yourself and your community is to take the advantage of striking first? As Glenn mentions at one point, I'd trade any number of people for one of ours any day. So you can be quite sure that people will go to extreme lengths to keep themselves and their current allies safe. Like I mentioned earlier, trust is the rarest form of currency in this new world, and when presented with the choice of protecting your circle of friends versus risking their safety, either for more resources or just to keep your hands morally clean, you are more likely to err on the side of preserving their safety. Morgan also appears to have learnt this lesson of self-preservation, being holed up alone in his tower and adopting an approach of shoot first, ask questions later on anyone who crosses into his territory. As sad as it sounds, in this state of the world, perhaps there are times when being a hypocrite is the price of staying alive. Of course, we cannot condone the governor's actions, but at the same time, we must acknowledge that there is some twisted logic behind them. Are they evil? Yes. But is it a necessary evil? Perhaps. But that's not to say he was innocent, because in this specific situation, there were actually other ways to handle it without bloodshed. In this case with the National Guard, the governor has custody of their lieutenant. Hence, it might have been very possible to broker some form of peace between them and integrate the soldiers into their community, which would undoubtedly strengthen them. There is some risk here, but then again, nothing ventured, nothing gained. The same applies to the governor's conflict with Rick's group. He had Andrea with him at Woodbury who vouched for them, and given that she's a mutual acquaintance with Rick's group, There was a good chance at the start that he could have also reached some form of agreement and live in coexistence with them. Unfortunately, his fear and his paranoia got the best of him, and he chose to torture Glenn and Maggie, and thereby ruining any future chance of a peaceful settlement. But back to the governor's methods. Is there risk to this approach as well? Most definitely. You might just piss off the wrong person or the wrong group one day, which happened with Michonne, after the governor tried to kill her to keep Woodbury's location a secret. Naturally, Michonne is angered by this and seeks her own vengeance against the governor. And by this point, Rick's group had intervened to save Glenn and Maggie as well. As the conflict escalates, the governor's moral descent continues to spiral downwards, accelerated by the revelation that his daughter was truly gone forever. This darkens his soul even further, and by this point there is no longer any ambiguity whatsoever over the morality of the governor's actions, such as his sadism in the form of his planned torture for Michonne, as well as his intentions to kill Rick and his group even after his proposed peace treaty. Eventually, this culminates in his most evil act, the massacre, when he opens fire on the residents of Woodbury out of frustration from losing to Rick at the prison, killing the very same residents that he committed heinous acts to protect. After the collapse of Woodbury, the governor has become a broken man and a shadow of his former self. He appears to have found another life with a new lover and a surrogate daughter, but once again his survival instincts kick in and draw him back to his former life. It's worth noting that the governor has been humbled by his defeat at Woodbury and realizes the truth of the saying that heavy lies the crown. While in the act of killing Martinez, a leader whom he deems unfit to ensure the group's survival, he is heard yelling about how he doesn't want the position of authority, but presumably feels no other choice but to take it up to protect his new family. Yes, you could say that the governor could have just taken his surrogate family and left on their own, or instead try to usurp the position of leadership from Martinez. But there is a chance of failure or death in those two scenarios, and simply killing Martinez would give him the highest probability of survival for his family. But given his reluctance in committing the act, we see that the governor takes no pleasure in it and is doing it for what he perceives to be a noble cause. Unfortunately, his selfish and vindictive nature seals his fate at the end, as there was an amicable solution right in front of him, in the form of sharing the prison with Rick's group. Rick practically delivered what he needed on a silver platter, but the governor's need for petty revenge kept him from the obvious solution. Perhaps it might be prudent to close with the words of Herschel and the moments when Rick ponders about the governor's actions, wondering what kind of sick mind is capable of such things. In Herschel's short and succinct reply, the kind of sick mind that this world creates.